speaker today is Trish Ennis, and she's going to be talking on the role of safety in reputation risk management. Sorry. Trish is a risk management and occupational safety and health professional with over 30 years of experience. Trish has expertise in many different areas, including but not limited to construction, multifamily and property management, and healthcare, as well as zoo and animal management. Trish is the executive director for the Colorado Safety Association in Denver, Colorado. Prior to joining the Colorado Safety Association, Trish worked in risk management for 14 years and served as the first director of workplace safety for the Denver Zoological Foundation from 2009 to 2011. And it served 10 years on the American Society of Safety Engineers as ASSE, now ASSP, Board of Directors as Region 2 Vice President of the Council of Professional Development, and served as the 100th Society President in 2015. She is currently serving as the ASSP Foundation Board of Trustees Chair. With that being said, we are so glad to have you, and I want to turn things over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Ogaga. I appreciate it. Just will give you a quick disclaimer at the very beginning. I'm more of a Zoom person than a Teams person, so I can't see myself, which is kind of nice when I'm presenting, but I also can't really monitor the chat. So I would just say, if you have questions as I go through this presentation, please just unmute and interrupt me and ask your questions. I find that if people are required to hold their questions until the end, sometimes the moment passes and they don't really want to ask the question anymore. So in the interest of giving you the opportunity to ask your questions, feel free to jump in as we go. And I think I'm going to try and share my screen. And I'm going to include computer sound. This is always dangerous. All right. So, Ogaga, can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, so I'm going to talk about the role of safety and reputation risk management and a little bit about risk management in general. I do have some examples that I will be showing in this presentation, and I would say, you know, they're fleet safety examples because those really get a lot of media attention. I probably could have had some fun and shared some zoo examples with you, but I wanted to give something that people could relate to a little bit. But I would say, as we go through this, kind of sub in your own experiences and say, how would this apply to my organization or to my industry? I'm not sure if we have any attendees from Western Carolina chapter or Tar Heel, but Ogaga told me that we might have 3 chapters participating today. So welcome. All right, I'm going to jump right in. This is the famous quote from Warren Buffett that really says it takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. If you think about that, you'll do things differently. I would submit to you that 5 minutes to ruin it is a generous amount of time these days. With social media, it probably takes more like 5 seconds to ruin it anymore, because everything we do is taking place live on TV, live on cell phones, live on cameras, dash cams. It's just, you know, we're being recorded everywhere we go, and everything that happens is happening real time, and people are learning about it real time. That gives this reputation risk situation or potential, it gives it legs, right? It can just expand so quickly, and it can be really hard to stay on top of things. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So we talk about what reputation risk is. It's a threat or a danger that can impact the reputation and good standing of a business. So it can affect you with your stakeholders and your investors, for example. Your employees, maybe, you know, we have a hard time attracting and retaining good employees these days. If you have a poor reputation, you might have trouble, you know, attracting and retaining good employees. Customers, any more Yelp reviews, Google reviews, just people getting on Facebook Live. If your customers have a bad experience, that might spread and become viral. It can affect your banking relationships and your insurance relationships. Maybe it affects your vendors. And so reputation risk is one of those kinds of risk that really covers so many different areas. And a lot of times we don't think about it as much as we should because it is kind of in the background and it's not always something that gets planned for. Reputation risk can arise from various different sources. It might be a direct action of the company. Maybe it's a regulatory noncompliance. In health and safety, you know, we hear about safety issues, falls, and in Colorado, really, we've been focusing a lot on trench and excavation safety, and I don't even know what the current fatality rate is nationwide right now. I think from trenching, it's something like 22 this year, which exceeds already last year's trenching and excavation fatalities. Those kinds of things make the news media. Data breach. We've probably all been a victim of a data breach at some point in our lives, whether we know it or not. Maybe there are legal actions that arise from direct actions of the company or even indirect actions. It might arise from actions of your employees or your coworkers, unethical conduct. It could be social media posts, customer interactions. And then there are all kinds of external threats, such as association with an unethical supplier. Maybe there's supply chain issues and you're not able to meet your customers' demands. All of these things can affect reputation. There are going to be areas where, as occupational safety and health professionals, we can have more of an impact on trying to prevent and manage these reputation risk potential. And that's the regulatory noncompliance and health and safety issues are on the top of that list. But I would say that as occupational safety and health professionals, many of us have the luxury of really having access to all different levels of an organization. We talk to the C-suite and we talk to the people in the field and we talk to the customers and we're on our project sites. If it's, you know, kind of an industry where you have a project site, maybe we're talking to vendors. And so we get to see all different aspects of an organization that some people who are in a more, I don't know if the term silo is right, but you know, they're in their silo, they're in their department, they're doing their job. They don't get to see everything the way many of us do. And I think that positions us to think like risk managers and bring value to the company by considering some of these things we're going to talk about here today. So one of the things that many of us have done is a what if scenario. And when you sit and think about a what if scenario, it's thinking about what could go wrong in my organization today. Put on your creative thinking hat, put on your critical thinking hat, put on your strategic thinking hat. There are 19 different thinking operations that we can access to think about what can go wrong in my organization today. That's not a fun place to live, is thinking about what could go wrong. Maybe you want to think about what could go right in my organization today and focus from that area. But really looking at all the potentials on what could happen today. Do we have a crane on site? Is there severe weather coming? Is there a pending strike? What could go wrong? Maybe it's just preventing a minor injury. That's a good thing to be thinking about, is how are we going to keep those things from happening? And as we think about that, we want to assess our organizational risk. So I have this image here, and I got this from I think it was from Zurich Insurance, actually. It was a good image, I think, that shows all different areas of organizational risk. And I would say a lot of times OSH professionals are focused on the upper left-hand side of this, which is the people side of the screen, right? So accident health, labor and employees, maybe recruiting and retention, knowledge management. But then we also have the financial side, stock exchange, capital markets, but financial side is also going to be potentially where your insurance coverages are. Operational side, sabotage, transportation, product liability, machinery breakdown. You know, if you're not thinking about maintenance and equipment breakdown, that's an area that, as health and safety professionals, that really feeds into things that can happen in our organizations that lead to loss. Strategic, looking at who are our joint venture partners and subsidiaries. Is there product development that could bring up some risk? And then you'll see that reputation is in that strategic category there. And then we've got our market risks, which are things like our geography, our patent infringement, who are our competitors, are there barriers to trade, what kind of market share, things like that. You're not going to work in all of these categories, but I think being aware of this bigger picture and starting to think about where can I have some influence, or what do I just need to know in order to manage the section that I am going to be focusing on, which might be people and strategic, might be operational. So be thinking about all of these different kinds of risk, and then take this list and maybe expand it for yourself to say, what's missing from this list that I'm aware of that can cause organizational risk for my company or my clients if you're doing consulting, for example. So when we assess organizational risk, really this is kind of risk assessment 101. Risk equals severity of risk times the likelihood that it's going to happen. So severity is the likely effect of a hazard, and you may rate it 1, 2, or 3. In this case, it says 1 is major, 3 is slight. Your categories might be different. Maybe, 3 is major and 1 is slight. This is an interesting version, but this is just one example of how you might rank severity. And then the likelihood. Again, this is a 1 through 3, with 1 being high. Number 1 is the highest. Number 3, harm will seldom occur. And then you're going to give your risk a value. The lower the number, the greater the risk, because if you go back and see that we've assigned the lower numbers to the higher severity and higher likelihood of occurrence. So then you can get your risk matrix or your risk assessment matrix, and you can kind of identify where you want to be focusing. Now, I think using this kind of a matrix to think about all kinds of things that can lead to reputation risk, this is a step that people don't often take, and it can be a very important step, and it can foster some good conversations within your organization. So once we kind of think about our risk, then I also encourage OSH professionals to understand all of the different ways of controlling risk within their organizations. So I came from I've worked in many industries. I started in consulting on a Superfund site, went to work for a construction company. I worked for a work comp carrier, which was a state fund here in Colorado. And from there, I went to the broker side. So I was the representative for the companies, helping them manage their risk. And in that role, it was fleet, it was worker safety, it was general liability, property risk, all kinds of risk. I had to understand their insurance programs to understand what their risk profile was. And that gave me a much broader view of sort of the environment that they were operating within and the tools they had in place to control their risk. I went to the zoo, and it was fun to take that risk management view back into the client realm. And it also made me a better consultant, I think, because suddenly I'm in the customer seat again, and I'm thinking, gosh, I haven't given some pretty bad advice over the years. Or maybe not bad, but incomplete. You need to do this, but then you don't tell them, how to do it. And so understanding the programs and the risk control measures that companies have in place can make you a better professional. So just in broad categories, we have risk avoidance. That's really going to be a conscious decision on behalf of the organization to avoid a particular risk. You may discontinue an operation, you may transfer or avoid that risk by transferring it to somebody else and having them do it. I frequently see that with things like confined space entry. We're not going to do it ourselves, we're going to hire someone. So we're avoiding that risk for our employees. We may decide to retain the risk, so we're going to retain it, and any consequent loss is going to be financed by us. That might be a large deductible program. It might be a captive that you're in where you have some skin in the game because you're paying the first many dollars of a loss, for example. Transfer, again, legal assignment of the cost to another party, but that can also be hiring someone else to do the work. You can transfer that risk to someone else. And then risk reduction, risks are reduced through control measures. And we all know when we talk about the hierarchy of controls, that might be something that, you know, maybe we're going to use PPE, or maybe we're going to use sound dampening materials or swap out a less hazardous material. These are all the ways that we can be controlling our risk. So when there is a crisis, there are some characteristics that we follow or that we can recognize that are common crisis characteristics. The first one might be panic. So when a crisis happens, people are not thinking clearly and they may enter into panic mode. I think those of us who do training and development for our teams, we know that you will respond to a crisis in the way that you've been trained, or respond to an emergency at least. That's why the airline does, you know, the emergency evacuation training and how to wear your seatbelts and how to use the oxygen mask. We could probably, any of us who fly on any regular basis could recite that entire thing. That's actually really effective when you get into this panic phase. If you have planned and you have a crisis response program that that people are aware of and that you use, you have drills and you practice it, that can be a really good tactic to prevent panic as a common crisis characteristic. So the event may escalate rapidly. People have a tendency to act irrationally. There might be chaos in communications, and the media might be right there. So giving you a zoo example, there are times when an animal gets out, and maybe that animal is going to be a risk to the visiting public or a risk to the keepers. So, you know, the zoos have to plan for that eventuality, and it happens probably more often than you might be aware. And so it's interesting that zoos are, of all the industries I've worked with, they're probably the best at planning for those kinds of emergencies and crisis. And they have drills. They call them Code Red, or whatever the color is for that particular zoo. In Denver, we had Code Red. And the Code Red would be, Code Red, the cassowary is out of his exhibit. Well, if you've ever seen a cassowary, they look a little bit like a prehistoric bird that has claws on their feet like a velociraptor, and they can do some significant damage to the visiting public if they were to come face to face with a guest or a keeper. These guys were getting out of their exhibit on a fairly regular basis, and so the zoo would call a Code Red. They would respond with weapons, with you know, sedatives like darts, nets, barricades, all kinds of things. They would sequester the guests in buildings, and they would respond to these codes. That's when it actually happens. But they plan for these things on a quarterly basis. And so when something does happen, everybody really responds pretty well to these emergencies because they do the training and the planning. And so that tendency to act irrationally and the chaos in communications is minimized, and the panic is minimized because they have a good plan in place for that. And then I will say, if I go back that side, omnipresent media, nothing gets the media's attention more than a wild animal getting loose in a community. So that's just something that sells news time on TV. Crisis identification. So thinking about, what does a crisis look like for your organization? And how would your organization respond? How are they going to respond if there's a loss of life? And all of the nuances that go into that loss of life. How do they communicate that to the family members? How do they respond to the OSHA inspection? How do they secure the scene when the incident happens? What about serious injury? What are the steps that are going to be taken in the event of a serious injury? What if a building collapses or there's a fire? Allegations of dishonest business practices, theft, fraud, or cyber breach. The response to the crisis is oftentimes the difference between reputation damage and enhancing your reputation or having it be a non-event from a reputation standpoint. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we kind of go in and talk about the definition of a crisis. It's any incident that can focus negative attention on a company and can have an adverse effect on the financial security, relationships, or reputation. So that's a definition of a crisis. So when we start talking about how to prepare, we're going to assess our organizational risks. So we've talked about that. We're going to establish a team, and we're going to create a formal plan and have communication objectives. This is the part I can't stress too much why it's important to have a plan and have some communication objectives in place in the event something does happen. When you build a team, you should have a wide variety of expertise on your team. They need to be able to work in a team setting, and they need to be able to perform well under pressure. So these are two characteristics that you really need to consider, because not everyone is going to be great on a crisis management team. Performing well under pressure, some people don't do as well with that as others. And so you can't just select your team members based on their position within your organization. This is going to be where you really want to put people on the team based on their strengths and their ability to communicate and their ability to operate well under pressure. And then give them an opportunity to understand what the plan is and to practice the drills and practice the plan when there's not a crisis taking place, so that you can kind of work out some of those kinks, when you do that. You might want to have more than one team. You may have multiple locations. I've worked with a number of contractors who have different building sites. They have a core team, which is their corporate team, but they also have a project level team. And those two teams are going to have to communicate with each other and execute through this crisis sort of in concert with each other. So your team composition, you have to have a team leader, someone who's going to take charge, the president of the organization or the CEO. You should have legal counsel. Things that we've seen with mishandling of event investigations and response is that maybe they do an investigation and share information out that then becomes discoverable and damages the company's ability to protect itself from liability. So legal counsel in many cases can direct the work, and that way you've got that work product protection in place. You need to have a spokesperson. Now let's talk about this team composition here. You notice I have president and spokesperson. In many cases, your top person, your CEO, your president, the supervisor on the project team, they may not be the best spokesperson. They may be too close to the event. They may be defensive. Maybe they're not a great communicator when it comes to talking to the media. And they might have other things that they need to be focused on and not working on being the spokesperson. The spokesperson to the community and to the media is one of the most important roles from a reputation standpoint that you will find. And so if you have someone standing up there, and again, maybe it's the president, and they're too close to the situation and they're going to say, this worker, we've given them every opportunity to work safely and they just refuse to do it. Okay, maybe that's even true. Is that what you want to say to the media in the event of a fatal accident? Now you're blaming the worker and you're doing it in a very public way. We remember the commentary with the executive from ExxonMobil saying, this crisis with the oil spill has just been so draining. I just want my life back. I get that. I could understand why that person wants their life back. But when you have so many people impacted by a crisis that was caused by a company, to make a comment like that, it landed in a bad way and a lot of people were offended by it. So finding a spokesperson who understands the nuances of saying, you don't want to say no comment because then they'll fill in the blanks, but you don't want to give too much information and you don't want to be defensive. So a spokesperson is critical, and a spokesperson who gets a little bit of training. You need an administrator. And then I will also say, often overlooked in the overall crisis management team is the receptionist or the person answering the phone at the company, for the company or for the location. So if the receptionist doesn't know what's going on and they're answering the phone, that sends a bad message. So you need to keep everyone in the loop when you have this crisis management team that you're putting together. So your crisis communication, again, the president may not be your best. You need to have an administrator and a receptionist. And then maybe your safety manager could be a spokesperson, but your safety manager needs to be part of the team. And then your insurance and your legal counsel. So this is just a little bit of an expanded list of who might be on your team. And learning how to talk to the media. So don't getting up and saying, oh, I heard that you had an auto accident and your truck hit another truck that was pushed into a bicyclist and now the bicyclist is dead. This was actually an accident that I had to investigate on behalf of one of my clients. You don't stand there and say no comment, but you also don't want to take questions and get flustered by the media just peppering you with questions and say more than you want to say. You want to have a buy time statement, and we're going to talk a little bit about a buy time statement. So having your team and then having a written plan. Your first hour response checklist is critical. Many companies will carry that. That'll be on their badge lanyard. It might be tucked into a pouch on their hard hat, however you carry those. It might be something on the visor of the vehicle, but it's the first hour response checklist, and it's just those things that need to take place in the very first hour. Emergency contacts are critical, notification procedures, having proper incident reports, an evacuation plan, a company fact sheet, and a communication plan, so that when you are starting to talk to the media or to your stakeholders, you're giving them good information. Keeping in mind, things that get said publicly anymore will stay out there for years to come, and people can resurrect your response to a crisis, and it gets rehashed over and over again. So a company fact sheet can be a good idea, just a little bit about the company, what we do, what our volume of work is, things like that can just give the media a little information so that they don't go digging for something and come up with maybe something that's back in the archives that you really don't want to see the light of day again. So giving them the fact sheet keeps them from doing too much research on you. Going back up here, emergency contacts and notification procedures. I have responded to a fatal accident with 2 trucks on a mine site where they hit and one of the drivers was ejected from the vehicle, and the emergency number that they had was his phone number. So the company was trying to call his family and his phone on his belt kept ringing. It's just a very terrible situation, and they didn't have good notification procedures, and their emergency contact lists were not up to date, and they weren't able to actually communicate with the person's family. Meanwhile, there's a helicopter overhead, and we're hoping that there's not going to be a picture of this person on the news before the family can be notified. Things like that, you have to think about it. So the first hour response checklist, again, will have your communications team, what their roles and responsibilities are, the notification process, employees and family, and that process can even be, don't just call the family and say you have a loved one in the hospital. Do you want someone driving across town when they're distraught? Maybe you send a vehicle, maybe you send an Uber or a taxi or something to take them. Those are the kinds of things that you want to have in your checklist. Secure the scene and have a way to try and keep the media contained and give them regular updates and say, we'll be back in 2 hours with an update. Right now, this is what happened. We're doing our investigation. We'll get back to you with more information as we have it. And then actually doing that. So don't say we'll get back to you and then never get back to them, because then they're going to start writing the story on their own and they'll kind of fill in the blanks, which can be adverse. All right, so if we look at internet and social media, anymore, it used to be what happened in Vegas stays in Vegas. It's now what happens on the internet, and social media stays on the internet and social media, and it stays there forever. And you can really just find so much information when you do these searches on companies. And this is even an outdated, some of the lists are here. You've got maybe Instagram. I think that's an old logo for Instagram. You've got YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, which is now Meta, right? Yahoo, Bing, Reddit, Google. I mean, there's all these places, and you can go out and search for one item and you'll You'll do a search, put in a search term, and you can come up with 1 million hits on that in less than a second. So really, the internet and social media is a good way to get a lot of information out to a lot of people very quickly. I'm not saying it's accurate. You have to manage that as best you can. If you think about YouTube, over 1 billion unique users each month. That's even an outdated number. Probably it's even more than that. 6 billion hours of video watched each month. I mean, that's a lot of information being consumed by a lot of people. YouTube is a great tool. It can also be your enemy if you can't control how the information is getting out there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a fleet example, just because this is one of those things where there's a lot of information on your fleet safety program. You know, there's the federal highway system, the Federal Motor Carriers Safety Administration. You can go out and look at a DOT carrier's, basically their ranking, and look at what kinds of incidents they've had. And if they have lots of accidents, if they have lots of maintenance issues, what is their score? The insurance carriers look at that before they rate your fleet for insurance coverage. And so the general public can go out and look at that information as well. So fleet accidents can be one of those ones that is interesting to think about from crisis communication. You're driving a vehicle for your company, or you have employees driving a vehicle, and that is a rolling billboard for your organization. If it has your name, your DOT number, your phone number, it's got a logo on it. That is a really big magnet for reputation risk. When we talk about fleet accidents, we have property damage, injury, liability. Those are some of the big buckets. But the bigger threat can come financially from a nuclear liability verdict from a jury. There are 3 types of damages: special damages, general damages, and punitive damages. The general damages and the punitive damages are where the jury, it's a little subjective, and a jury can really expand on those damages significantly based on things like reputation, the perception of how the company responded to the incident, how well they controlled their program going into it. All of those things can result in significant losses. General damages might include things like pain and suffering, loss of consortium, inconvenience. Inconvenience is a big category, right? Punitive damages, designed to punish the defendant for an egregious conduct. So an example of that is negligent entrustment. Negligent entrustment may be considered egregious. So what is negligent entrustment? It's just an insurance term, right? Employers are expected to understand the risks of putting a driver behind the wheel of a vehicle. This applies to company vehicles, hired non-owned vehicles, personal vehicles. If you have people driving for your organization and you don't know if they are qualified to drive on behalf of your company, that can be considered negligent entrustment. You're entrusting them to represent you behind the wheel of a vehicle, and you're negligent in understanding if that's a good decision or not. Now, sometimes it's intentional. I worked with a very large organization. It was a fast casual restaurant chain that has locations around the country and internationally. Their insurance carrier every year would run the motor vehicle records of their drivers, and they would pull a handful of them out and say, these drivers, we are not going to insure them. Don't let them drive for you. We're not insuring them if they're driving your company vehicle. So they exclude them. The company responded by paying those drivers that were excluded by the insurance carrier to drive their own vehicles and giving them a car allowance. Now, in my mind, that is the definition of negligent entrustment, because they know that these drivers have something on their driving record that makes them a bad risk from the insurance carrier, but they're going to pay them to drive their own vehicle. What happens if there's a terrible accident and one of the drivers is driving impaired and goes through a crosswalk and strikes a pedestrian? Maybe it's in a school zone. You can write that story yourself with your own imagination. And then people do the investigation and they find that this was the practice. Driver management and negligent entrustment are big. I was on a CNA website, CNA Insurance, the other day, and Tom Henderson was the speaker. He said there are 43 states that don't allow insurance companies to cover a claim if it involves negligent entrustment. I had never heard that before, and I haven't been able to verify which states those are, but that's a big deal. So if you have this in your organization and someone has a large claim and your state says, we're not covering it because it's negligent entrustment, now suddenly you've got a much bigger problem because none of the claim is going to be covered. So thinking about that, I'm going to show you a video, and let me know if you, I guess if you can't hear the sound on this. Hopefully I did it right.
Blinded by blue dust. Some scary moments for a 7 News viewer on E470 after a truck lost part of its load of mystery powder yesterday. 7 News reporter Lindsay Watts talked to State Patrol about this kind of near accident and where you especially need to watch out.
That a hazard can come at you at any time.
As blinding dust rolled across the windshield, this driver's dash cam was rolling too. He tells us he can't believe no one crashed.
That video is a great example of your vision that you're expecting to be there as you're driving at highway speeds at 65, 75 miles per hour, suddenly going to zero.
A closer look shows a package falling from a truck, creating the blue storm. As the truck pulls over, there's many more where that one came from.
In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to review the video again with a larger screen.
State Patrol Sergeant Rob Madden says what we showed him here isn't very common because there can be such high penalties for commercial vehicles that lose a load. He says it's personal cars that are more of a risk.
People will do some yard cleanup and they'll put things in the back of their truck or a trailer, and then they'll drive out and not think of properly tarping it.
We asked State Patrol about trouble spots where you really need to be cautious, and they pointed us here to Highway 93 in Jefferson County, where not only is there a landfill bringing with it a lot of truck traffic, more of that here closer to Golden, the potential for rocks in the road with haulers headed to the quarry. State Patrol is now investigating what happened here on E470 near Denver's airport. Troopers say look at this as a reason to stay off your phone and on alert.
Had he been doing something else and had looked up at the last second, he would not have known what was happening in front of him and which lane was clear, which lane was not clear.
Okay, so going back, well, I'm going to move forward to this slide, but just talking about the video that we just saw. The thing that fascinates me about that video, really, this was a customer. They called me and said, we had an incident and it's on the news. It's out on YouTube and it's on the news, the local news. When we looked at the YouTube channel, and I haven't looked at it recently, it had something like 17 people had viewed it. So I told them, I don't think this is going viral, not with 17 people looking at it. However, it is on the news and it is a reputation problem, but it's a bigger problem. It's a load securement problem. And what are you guys doing to respond to this? Oh, and by the way, you have a commercial vehicle and the State Patrol is now going to open an inspection on your location and they're going to look at everything. So we kind of talked to them about that. But the thing that was interesting is if you watch the media coverage on that, the media really likes to make it interesting. Mystery powder, blue storm, you know, they're using terms that make this like capture people's attention and they're thinking about it. But the other thing that happened is you noticed further on in the video, they're standing in front of a sign that says Republic Services or whatever the name of the landfill operator. So this story evolved. The landfill had nothing to do with that incident, but suddenly they're the culprit of things on the road and things coming off of vehicles and all the truck traffic, and people need to be careful. And so this story focused on the incident, but then brought somebody else in, and their reputation was now suddenly being discussed on national media. So having a plan, maybe you're doing Google alerts or trolling the media just to make sure that you understand how you're being pulled into someone else's story, I think, is the point there. And we see that on other kinds of incidents too. If there's anything that hits the media and you've got a banner on a project site fence and you know the media is parked in front of your name on the fence, people then start to associate that incident with your name. So those are some of the more uncommon but interesting scenarios that you kind of have to keep your eye on, because you might get a call and people will say, what was your involvement with this incident? And you need to have a script to say, this was not us. We just have to be, we happen to work on that project, but we were not involved, or whatever your comment is. But being proactive is typically a better idea than not. Now, this picture that I'm showing you here, this was this happened 2 years ago, I believe, 2 years ago here in Colorado. A semi driver was arrested after he was driving down Interstate 70 out of the mountains, and he crashed into a bunch of stopped vehicles under this bridge. 28 vehicles were impacted, 4 people were dead. It was horrific. And talking about social media, this guy was on dash cams, including a state patrol dash cam, for probably 40 miles prior to the incident. That's a hard thing to overcome. And he was going 85 plus miles an hour at some point and was in the correct lane and blew right by the runaway truck ramp. And so, you know, this is the kind of thing that ends up in the media, and it was really terrible. So you get to the end and you see the aftermath. This can be a hard image to ever overcome if it happens to your organization. So again, those of us in health and safety, we understand the value of having a plan. Having that plan encompass more than just workplace safety, understanding organizational risk and what activities are we managing and controlling that can help manage and control some of those other risks. So providing a safe workplace is key. Protecting the reputation of the organization, attracting and retaining high potential employees. These are all things that we have as goals. And so, again, I can't emphasize enough the value of planning, the value of having a written plan, and the value of practicing that plan. And a lot of people never actually have drills or practice their plan. I would say probably not this audience that I'm talking to today, but your customers in many cases may not be planning. I went and did some emergency drills with some hospitality organizations, and one of them was a ski lodge up in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, and they had never done an emergency fire drill. So we set it up to have the fire department respond. So they pulled the fire alarm, the fire department responded. And what we found in that plan was the fire department came in the bottom of the building and took the stairs up because they're not going to jump in the elevator. So they're carrying all their gear. Well, the communication from the resort said it's on the 3rd floor, but the signage on the interior stairway didn't match the signage in the elevator. And so the fire department responded to the wrong floor. On top of that, all of the staff came out and gathered in front of the building, and unbeknownst to any of us, because we'd never done this plan before, they were standing around the fire hydrant. And so when the fire department showed up, they couldn't find the fire hydrant immediately. And so the combination of the wrong floor and the obscured fire hydrant, all of those things would have resulted in probably a total loss of the building, because it was 5 to 7 minutes of fumbling around when you really need to respond quickly. So having a plan and practicing that plan is one of the best things you can do from a crisis management and crisis assessment perspective. So I will open it up for any questions or comments that anybody has, and letting you know that I appreciate it, and that this truly was an emergency. We did go around the sign to go to the winery. This was a sign in Rochester. We were going to the winery, and we decided that somebody must have thought that that would qualify as emergency traffic. So I took a picture of it because I thought it was fun. Having said that, I am open to your questions. I think I'm stopping sharing. Did I stop? You're on mute, Ogaga.
Oh, Welcome to the virtual world.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. A lot of information. I don't know how you're able to put that within 48, 49 minutes.
Yeah, it's
Thank you.
probably too much. I hope it wasn't, but
No. It was great information. Thank you. Yeah, I enjoyed it. All right. So are there questions? Let me check the chart and see if we have anything. Okay, we got a response from Mike. Great presentation. Okay, thank you. So we still have a few minutes. If there are questions, we'll take those. While you're preparing those, I have one question. I think I would relate to this topic from a personal experience. In my previous employment, I work in the academic industry, so we had uh, an alleged exposure issue, and there were like some faculty members were dying from what was said to be a um, a VOC exposure, like a volatile organic compound, which nobody knew what it was. If it was benzene or whatever that's underground, nobody knows. But they said people were diagnosed of cancer and they died as a result of it. So it made the news and it was really difficult to manage. So where my question lies is on the communication with the media, because we had a plan, but not like a very strong plan, so to speak. But how to get the information streamlined was a problem. So you would think that, okay, the media will check in with a news outlet or with the associate vice chancellor for environmental health and safety to get the most relevant information. But then information will just spring from nowhere, from an employee, from a student, and all that. So how do you manage this information release to make sure that what is coming out from the organization, it's coming out from the right source?
yeah, well, that is a very difficult thing to manage, right? Especially an organization with an ongoing investigation, right? Because you can't always stop your employees from talking to the media. All you can do is try to give the counterpoint to their point, to say, there's a lot of misinformation out there from people who are not close to the investigation. However, we are continuing to look into this, and give them enough information, right, so that they know that you're looking into it. If it's a scene, you can try and keep your employees from leaving and talking, to the media while you're doing the initial phases of the investigation. But long term, you're not going to be able to do that. Locally here, we just had a grow operation, one of the marijuana grow houses, because we're known for our cannabis industry, and they've recently organized, and they had employees talking to all the media outlets about how horrible the safety record was at this particular organization. And all they could do was try to manage the conversation by giving good information that might refute what's out there. But you're right, that is difficult. Having a plan in place, talking to your employees about the impact of sharing information to the media. I think one of the things that occurred to me while you were talking, Ogaga, is that we think about the media as the conversation that we need to manage, but our reputation as professionals and leaders with the employees in the organization is also something that needs to be managed. And so managing that on an ongoing basis and making sure that our communications are respectful and timely, and that we're giving what they call right speech, right? We're giving good information when it's needed and not just information, right? Good information and when it's needed and relevant, and not dismissing people's concerns because we're too busy with a bigger picture. We have to understand that if they have concerns, and we need to understand those and help them manage through that, so that when something like this does happen, you've got a good internal reputation to stand on that will help you with this bigger conversation. Right.
Thank you. All right, we have a question on the chat from Mike Wolf. Any suggestions around bomb threat communications with the media?
Yeah, so bomb threat that's a scary one, right? and you've got people that may be exposed to the potential risk beyond just your employees. This specific example is one where there was a bomb threat and the internal crisis team was involved, but the receptionist was not aware of it. So when the media was calling the receptionist, she's like, bomb threat? What bomb threat? Right? So one of the things you need to do is make sure that your entire team has the talking points, that you've got an evacuation plan in place, and that when you talk to the media, you can say, we've had a threat, we've contacted the authorities, and they're investigating the severity and the legitimacy of this, but we're taking every precaution. And just, be honest about it may be real, and we're taking steps to manage. So.
All right, thank you. I think Mike was good with that. Any other comment or question? Just quickly, one more from me. How do you get management to really buy in, especially risks from a safety point of view? That, okay, there is a chance that this, could happen and then ruin the reputation of the company if management does not prioritize that as part of its priority, so to speak. How do you get their buy-in?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's going to differ from company to company. Sometimes it takes a hit to the reputation for them to start listening to you. That same restaurant chain that I was speaking about with the fleet issue also had a food safety issue. And I told them, your biggest threat is your threat to your reputation. And when they had food safety issues, their share value dropped 45% in a period of 2 months. That got their attention. And then we were able to start having a more robust conversation about how to manage reputation risk. So having examples and saying, I have some concerns about this and how it could impact our reputation. Here are my suggestions. And just tapping them on the shoulder with it occasionally, right? Because it might take that persistently annoying presence of, hey, continue to annoy them with it and say, I'm worried about this. Here's an example, and have small steps. Don't try to come in with a whole program until you have their buy-in for baby steps. Maybe do a pilot project, maybe manage it for one event. So.
Thank you so much. All right, so if there are no questions, okay, Mike, we got your comment. Okay, so if there are no questions, I want to thank you all so much, folks from other chapters and other